The city was waking up to another busy morning, but for the man who had no roof over his head, the day was no different from the countless others before. He sat on a cold bench near the park, his old coat wrapped tightly around him as a weak shield against the morning chill. People walked past him quickly, holding their coffee cups and talking on their phones, not once glancing in his direction. He was used to being invisible, but deep down, he still wished someone would notice him, not to pity him, but just to see him as a human being. Hunger tugged at his stomach, but he tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the quiet sound of birds in the trees. He stood and started moving toward a nearby trash bin, hoping to find something half-eaten. Just as he bent down, a sound cut through the usual morning noise. It was sharp, urgent, and strange. His eyes turned quickly toward the source. A woman, dressed neatly as if she were heading to an important meeting, stumbled and clutched her chest. Her bag fell to the ground, scattering papers and a phone. In the next moment, her knees buckled and she collapsed on the pavement. People stopped for only a second, shocked by what they saw, but no one moved closer. Some whispered, some froze, and a few even stepped back. The homeless man didn't think. His body moved before his mind could catch up. He rushed toward her, his worn-out shoes slapping the concrete. Dropping down beside her, he noticed her face pale and her breathing shallow. "Stay with me," he muttered softly, though he wasn't sure she could hear. He had no medical training, but life on the streets had taught him to stay calm in chaos. He tilted her slightly, making sure her airway was clear, and called out loudly for someone to dial emergency services. His voice cracked from shouting, but his urgency shook people awake. A young passerby finally pulled out a phone and made the call. Time seemed to slow. The woman's eyes fluttered, her lips moving weakly but no words escaping. He kept speaking to her, telling her she would be all right, that help was on the way. His hands trembled, but he refused to let fear take over. He gently placed her head on his folded coat, giving her something soft to rest on instead of the hard ground. More people gathered around now, staring at the scene, but still keeping their distance. Some filmed with their phones, others whispered to each other. To him, none of that mattered. All that mattered was the woman in front of him, fighting for breath. Minutes felt like hours before the distant wail of sirens filled the air. Relief washed over him, but he didn't stop watching her. When the paramedics arrived, he quickly moved aside, giving them space but staying close in case they needed to know what happened. One of them nodded at him with a brief "good job" before focusing on the woman. They checked her vitals, secured oxygen, and lifted her onto a stretcher. The man stood there, breathing heavily, his heart still racing from the adrenaline dot as the ambulance doors closed. He realized he would never know what happened to her. No one asked his name, no one offered him thanks. The crowd dispersed, life in the city quickly returning to normal, as though nothing unusual had happened. He picked up his old coat, now stained with dust, and slowly walked back to the bench. His stomach still ached with hunger, and his body still felt weak. But inside there was a small warmth that hadn't been there before. He knew he had done the right thing. For him, it was not about being a hero. It was about being human. He thought about how so many times people had ignored him, avoided eye contact, or crossed the street to not walk near him. Yet when he saw someone in need, his instinct had been to help. Sitting back down on the bench, he let out a long sigh. He did not expect recognition, and he did not imagine that this moment would change anything in his life. To him, it was just another day of survival, another day where he tried to do something right despite having so little. He leaned back, gazing at the sky above the tall buildings. He did not know who the woman was. He did not know where she came from or what her life looked like. To him, she was just another stranger in the endless crowd, someone who needed help. What he could not imagine was that this simple act would connect his broken life with a world far beyond his reach, a world of power, wealth, and influence. For now, though, he remained just a tired man on a park bench, unaware of how his choice that morning had quietly set a chain of events in motion that would one day change everything. Asterisk. The days after the incident passed like any other for the homeless man. He continued waking up under the same open sky, searching for scraps of food, and moving between benches and corners where he wouldn't be chased away. Life for him was a cycle of hunger, cold nights, and long hours of loneliness. He never mentioned the woman he had helped to anyone, not that he had anyone to share his thoughts with. To him, it was just something he had to do. He had seen danger before, he had seen pain, and he had felt it himself, so when he saw her collapse, helping her had been as natural as breathing. He never expected that the moment would mean anything beyond that day. Somewhere else, in the quiet of a hospital room, the woman he saved slowly opened her eyes. Machines beeped softly beside her, and a nurse adjusted the tubes and wires attached to her. Her memory was blurry, like fragments of a dream. She remembered walking through the park, then a sharp pain in her chest, and then a pair of worried eyes looking down at her. A rough but gentle voice telling her to stay awake. The last thing she recalled before everything went dark was the feeling of someone's hand holding hers, steadying her, keeping her present. When her husband arrived, shaken and frightened, he asked her what had happened. She told him about the stranger who came to her aid, about how he seemed to appear out of nowhere when no one else moved. Her voice was weak, but her words were filled with emotion. She described the man's worn coat, his tired face, his urgency in calling for help. She didn't know who he was, but she knew that if he hadn't acted when he did, she might not be alive. Her husband, a man used to commanding boardrooms and running companies, felt his chest tighten with gratitude toward a stranger he had never met. The woman's recovery was slow, but each day she grew stronger. What did not fade, however, was her determination to find the man who had saved her life. She spoke often about him, not with pity, but with deep respect. He had nothing, she said, yet he gave me everything in that moment. He gave me time I might not have had. Her words stayed with her husband. For the first time in years, the powerful CEO found himself restless, not because of work or business, but because of a personal debt of the heart. Meanwhile, the homeless man carried on in silence. He had no idea that the woman had survived, no idea that she was thinking about him, and no clue that her husband, a man of immense wealth and influence, was already beginning to wonder how to find him. At night, when the city grew quiet, he sometimes thought about her. He wondered if she had lived, but he never let himself dwell too much. It was easier to convince himself she was fine and to move on. Dwelling on the what-ifs only made the emptiness of his life harder to bear. One evening, as the city lights glowed and people hurried home, the CEO sat with his wife by her bedside. They spoke not of business or wealth, but of the unknown man who had shown more humanity than most. The wife insisted they couldn't just let the matter go. He didn't have to stop. He could have walked away like everyone else, but he didn't. People like him deserve more than silence. We have to find him. The CEO, who was not used to being challenged in such a way, looked into his wife's eyes and knew she was right. He promised her he would do whatever it took to track down the man who had been her savior down in the days that followed. Quiet preparations began. Without making it public, the CEO discreetly instructed a few trusted people to look for a man fitting the description his wife gave. He told them to focus near the park, to check shelters, and to search the streets. To most of the city, the homeless were unseen, forgotten figures blending into the background. But now, for the first time, someone with power wanted to see him, wanted to bring him out of the shadows. The man, unaware of all this, was sitting on the same bench where his life had changed without him realizing it. He watched the flow of people around him, busy, important, always in a hurry. He rubbed his hands together for warmth, still thinking only of how to make it through the night. He did not know that his small act of kindness had already begun to ripple far beyond that bench, drawing the attention of a world he never thought he would touch. In the quiet comfort of her home, far removed from the crowded streets and cold benches of the city, the woman recovered slowly. The doctors advised her to take it easy, to avoid stress, and to appreciate the second chance she had been given. Each time she closed her eyes, however, she could see his face again, the stranger who had bent down on the pavement, whose hands trembled but whose eyes stayed steady. The image of him haunted her, not in fear, but in gratitude. She couldn't let it go, and neither could her husband, the CEO, a man known for his iron will and sharp business mind, found himself strangely unsettled. For years he had believed that money and influence could control almost everything. Yet here was a moment when none of those things had mattered. His wife's life had not been saved by a doctor, a guard, or someone from their wealthy circle. It had been saved by a man who had nothing. That truth cut deeply into him. He would sit in his study late at night, thinking about the words his wife kept repeating. He gave me everything when he had nothing. The search for the homeless man was not simple. The city had many souls like him, people who drifted from one corner to another, unseen and forgotten. The CEO's assistants spoke to workers at soup kitchens, volunteers at shelters, even janitors and street cleaners who might have seen someone who matched the description. Some said they saw a man with an old coat near the park. Others claimed he often slept close to an abandoned building. There were hints, but nothing clear. The CEO's people came back with fragments, never the whole picture. Meanwhile, the man himself had no idea that someone was looking for him. His days continued as they always had. He spent his mornings moving through familiar streets, his afternoons resting where he could, and his nights searching for warmth in a city that rarely showed him kindness. He didn't expect kindness anymore, and when he thought of the woman, he told himself she was probably safe now and had forgotten all about him. It didn't matter. He hadn't helped her for thanks. But in the hospital, the woman's determination only grew. "We can't stop looking," she told her husband one evening. "I need to thank him. I need him to know that he didn't just save my life, he gave me hope in people again. I want him to see that he matters." Her words struck the CEO deeply. She was not only alive but inspired. He realized that finding this man wasn't just about paying back a debt. It was about showing his wife that goodness, even from the most unexpected places, would never go unnoticed. One night, while sitting by the fire, the CEO thought back to his own past. He remembered the early days of his career when he too had faced struggles, though never as harsh as the man in the streets. He remembered the people who had once helped him when he had nothing. Somewhere inside him, a memory of being vulnerable connected him, in a small way, to the man they were trying to find. It was this thought that convinced him to continue, no matter how long it took. At the same time, whispers of the incident began to spread quietly among hospital staff and local volunteers. A few nurses mentioned the story of the homeless man who had rushed to help when no one else did. A volunteer at a shelter had heard something similar. The story passed from person to person, changing slightly with each retelling, but always carrying the same core. A man with nothing had saved a woman with everything. The tale was slowly building its own life in the city, even if the man himself was unaware of it. As weeks went by, the woman's strength returned, but her heart remained restless. She often looked out the window from their mansion, her thoughts wandering to the streets she rarely saw up close. Somewhere out there was the man who had changed everything for her. She imagined what his life must be like, how he must still be sleeping in the cold, still going unnoticed. She could not accept that. "He deserves more than this silence," she whispered to herself. And so, the quiet mission continued. The CEO had the resources, the influence, and the determination. His wife had the heart, the gratitude, and the vision of what they needed to do. Together, they carried the same thought every night before bed. They would not rest until they found him. They did not know that the man, on the very same nights, sat beneath the stars, thinking only of survival, completely unaware that his act of kindness had tied his fate to theirs forever. Asterisk, the week stretched into months, and life carried on as usual for most people in the city. The streets bustled with workers, the cafes filled with chatter, and the parks overflowed with families on weekends. For the homeless man, however, each day was a repetition of the last searching for food, finding somewhere safe to rest, and avoiding the eyes of those who preferred not to see him. He had long accepted this cycle, never imagining that anyone beyond the streets would care about his existence. Yet far away, inside a mansion filled with warmth and comfort, his face was still etched in the mind of the woman whose life he had saved. Her recovery was complete now. She could walk through the gardens of her home again, greet her friends, and even return to some of her social activities. But one thing remained unchanged: her determination to find the man who had come to her side when no one else had. Each conversation with her husband returned to the same subject. "Have they found him yet?" she would ask, and every time he shook his head. The CEO was not a man who gave up easily. He had built empires through persistence, and this search became as personal to him as any business deal he had ever fought to win. The CEO expanded his efforts. He spoke privately to charity organizations, instructed his assistants to leave food and clothing at shelters, and quietly asked if anyone had seen a man who matched the description his wife gave: a tired face, an old coat, a man who spent time near the park. Slowly, the pieces began to fit together. One shelter worker remembered a man who often slept near an abandoned building not far from downtown. Another volunteer recalled seeing someone like him sit on the same bench by the park almost every morning. These small details were enough. Late one afternoon, as the sun dipped low and painted the city in shades of orange, the CEO and his wife drove through streets in a black car. They didn't want the search handled entirely by assistants anymore. They wanted to see for themselves. The car slowed near the park, and there, as if waiting for destiny to reveal him, sat the man on his familiar bench. His coat was patched, his shoes worn thin, but his posture was calm. He watched the flow of people with quiet eyes, unnoticed by them all. The wife pressed her hand against the window, her heart pounding. "That's him," she whispered. Her husband looked closer and saw, for the first time, the man whose act of courage had saved his world. For a moment, silence filled the car. It wasn't pity they felt, it was something deeper, a mixture of awe, sadness, and gratitude. They stepped out of the car, drawing a few curious glances from passers-by. The man on the bench looked up, surprised. He wasn't used to people approaching him with kindness in their eyes. Usually, it was police asking him to move along or strangers avoiding him entirely. Now, a well-dressed couple stood in front of him, their expressions filled with sincerity. "Do you remember me?" the woman asked softly. Her voice trembled as she spoke, not from weakness but from emotion. The man blinked, his memory searching. Then it came back, the woman who had collapsed in the park, the one whose hand he had held while waiting for help. He nodded slowly, almost uncertain if he should admit it. "You saved my life," she said, her eyes glistening with tears. "If it weren't for you, I wouldn't be standing here today." The man looked down, embarrassed. He wasn't used to being thanked. To him, it was simply what anyone should have done. "I just did what I could," he murmured. The CEO stepped forward, his voice firm yet gentle. "You did more than that. You gave me back my wife. You gave us another chance at life together. That is something we can never repay, but we must try." The homeless man shifted uncomfortably, unsure of how to respond. Gratitude of this magnitude was foreign to him. He had spent years being ignored, and now here were two people treating him as if he mattered more than anything else. They invited him to join them for a meal. At first, he refused, reluctant to step into a world so different from his own. But the woman insisted, and the sincerity in her voice left him no choice. For the first time in many years, he sat at a proper table, with warm food in front of him and people who wanted to hear his story. He spoke little, embarrassed by his past, but the CEO and his wife listened with patience and compassion. That night marked the beginning of something he could not yet understand. What he thought was a brief encounter in the park had become a bond, a connection that would soon alter the course of his life forever. As they drove him back to the shelter where he sometimes stayed, the CEO whispered to his wife, "This is only the beginning. We'll make sure he never has to live like this again." The man walked back into the shelter with a strange feeling in his chest. It wasn't fear, and it wasn't hunger. It was something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The morning after meeting the wealthy couple, the homeless man woke up in the shelter with a feeling he couldn't explain. His life had been the same for so many years that he had stopped expecting anything to change. Yet now his thoughts were filled with the woman he had saved, the one who had returned to thank him, and her husband who had spoken with such conviction. For the first time in a long while, he wondered if life might hold something more for him than simply surviving one day at a time. Meanwhile, inside their mansion, the woman and her husband sat together at the breakfast table, still moved by the night before. She couldn't stop talking about the man's humility, how he had downplayed what he did, and how uncomfortable he looked when praised. Her husband listened quietly, sipping his coffee, but his mind was already working. He was a man who built fortunes by seizing opportunities and planning carefully. This was no different. Only this time, the mission wasn't about money, it was about changing a life. Later that week, the couple returned to the shelter. This time, they didn't come just to thank him. They came with an offer. They told him they wanted to help him rebuild his life. At first, he refused. Pride and years of disappointment had hardened him. "I'm fine," he said quietly, his eyes looking down. But the woman reached across the table and touched his hand, her voice gentle. "You weren't fine that day in the park, and still, you chose to save me. Please let us do the same for you." Her sincerity pierced through the walls he had built around his heart. Slowly he nodded. Within days, arrangements were made. The man was given clean clothes, a medical checkup, and a warm room in a safe place. For someone who had grown used to sleeping under bridges or on cold benches, the simple luxury of a bed felt almost unreal. He lay awake the first night, staring at the ceiling, trying to accept that this was no dream. The couple visited him often, talking with him not as someone to be pitied, but as someone whose worth they recognized. The CEO introduced him to people who could guide him into steady work. At first he struggled. Years of hardship had left him unsure of himself. But with encouragement and patience, he began to adjust. He learned new skills, met people who treated him with respect, and started to believe in his own dignity again. Slowly, the man who had once been invisible to the world was beginning to stand tall. One evening, the couple invited him to their home for dinner. He hesitated, feeling out of place in such an environment, but they reassured him. As he entered the grand dining hall, he felt small at first, but the warmth of their welcome eased his nerves. Over the meal, they spoke openly. The woman looked at him with tears in her eyes. "You don't realize what you gave us," she said softly. "You gave me back my life. You gave my husband back his wife. That is a gift beyond measure. Whatever we give you now will never equal what you gave us, but we hope it can give you the life you deserve." The CEO then stood, his voice calm but filled with emotion. He announced that he wanted the man to work with one of his companies, not as charity, but as a trusted employee. He offered him training, guidance, and a position that would give him stability and independence. The man sat stunned, unable to speak. He had expected maybe a meal, maybe a small gesture of thanks, but never this. He had gone from being unseen on the streets to being offered a chance at a real future. Tears welled in his eyes as he finally found the words. "I didn't save her for this. I just couldn't stand by and do nothing. The CEO nodded, his own eyes heavy with emotion. And that is exactly why you deserve it. You gave without expecting anything. That kind of heart deserves to be lifted, not forgotten. From that day forward, his life took a path he had never imagined. He found work, a place to live, and slowly rebuilt his sense of purpose. The city that once ignored him now saw him differently. But more than recognition or comfort, what mattered most was that he felt human again, valued, respected, and connected. The story of his kindness spread quietly, whispered among those who had once walked past him without notice. To some, it was just a tale of luck. But to the couple whose lives he touched, it was a living proof that compassion could come from the most unexpected places, and that even one small act of courage could change lives forever. And for the man who had once believed he was destined to be forgotten, it was a reminder that kindness, even when given in silence, always finds its way back.